Happy Tuesday, everybody. Hope you're having a good day today so far. Having a good week. All right. So today I said that I was going to talk about some of the lies that we were told about the war in Afghanistan. And as always, we're going to start out with our daily promise. But my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Philippians 4:19. God is all powerful. He is able to provide for every need that meets a believer in his walk with Christ. As humans, we often think of needs in the light of food, shelter, and physical amenities. However, our real needs are spiritual, for our spirit is eternal. Jesus has provided for all of our spiritual needs, as the Apostle Peter says in his second letter. According as his divine power hath given unto us all things that pertain unto life and godliness, through the knowledge of him that hath called us to glory and virtue, whereby are given unto us exceeding great and precious promises, that by these ye might be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. 2 Peter chapter 1 verses 3 and 4. The Philippians trusted in God's promises, and they gave to the Lord's work out of what little they possessed. Praise God that we can trust in him for our daily provision of all our needs. Absolutely. And I am witness to everything that we've needed being supplied to us, through his grace and mercy. Okay, so I will link all of these pages that I found in the description box if you want to go take a look at them. The one that I mentioned the other day was from The Intercept, and it's the one lie after another about what we were doing in Afghanistan. It's written by James Risen, and this was just written in August on the 26th of 2021. So let's take a look at it. In the immediate aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in late 2001, U.S.-backed Afghan warlord Abdul Rashid Dostum's forces murdered hundreds, perhaps thousands of Taliban prisoners by jamming them into metal shipping containers and letting them suffocate. At the time, Dostum was on the CIA's payroll and had been working with U.S. Special Forces to oust the Taliban from power. The Bush administration blocked subsequent efforts to investigate the mass murder, even after the FBI interviewed witnesses among the surviving Afghans who had been moved to the U.S. prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and after human rights officials publicly identified the mass grave site where Dostum's forces had disposed of bodies. Later, President Barack Obama promised to investigate and then took no action. I can also link some articles below about the human rights violations and the torture that went on at Guantanamo Bay during that time if you would like to look at it. Instead, Hollywood stepped in and turned Dostum into a hero. The 2018 movie 12 Strong, uh, is that gnostic, like jihadist? I don't know. Account of the partnership between U.S. Special Forces and Dostum in the 2001 invasion whitewashed Dostum even as his crimes continued to pile up in the years after the prisoner massacre. At the time of the movie's January 2018 release, Dostum was in exile, hiding from criminal charges in Afghanistan for having ordered his bodyguards to rape a political opponent, including with an assault rifle. The movie, which was filmed in New Mexico, was based on a book that a New York Times reviewer called a rousing, uplifting, Toby Keith singing piece of work. For 2 decades, Americans have told each other one lie after another about the war in Afghanistan. The lies have come from the White House, Congress, the State Department, the Pentagon, and the CIA, as well as from Hollywood, cable news pundits, journalists, and the broader culture, sorry. Americans have hungered for a simple storyline, with heroes and villains to make sense of the largest war in U.S. history. They have wanted stories like 12 Strong to make them feel good, but at the very edge of the American empire, the war was nasty and brutish and brought out in Americans the same imperial arrogance that doomed the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So the 9/11 wars. This month, as the Taliban swiftly took control of Kabul and the American-backed government collapsed, the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, the government's watchdog over the Afghan experience, issued his final report. The assessment includes remarkably candid interviews with former American officials involved in shaping U.S. policy in Afghanistan that collectively offer perhaps the most biting critique of the 20-year American enterprise ever published in an official U.S. government report. Quote, the extraordinary costs were meant to serve a purpose, though the definition of that purpose evolved over time, end quote. So, released in the days after Kabul fell, the report reads like an epitaph for America's involvement in Afghanistan. Let's see. What does that word mean? So, if you're not sure what an epitaph is, it is a literary piece that is commemorating usually a deceased person. So, it's or the inscription on your tombstone. So, one of the first things the U.S. did after gaining effective control over Afghanistan following the Taliban's ouster in 2001 was to set up secret torture chambers. Beginning in 2002, the CIA tortured both Afghans and foreign prisoners flown to these torture rooms from all over Central Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The worst torture chamber was nicknamed the Darkness by the prisoners sent there, who suffered such complete sensory deprivation that they did not even know they were in Afghanistan. They were chained in solitary confinement with no light and music blaring constantly. They were hung by their arms for as long as 2 days, slammed against walls, forced to lie naked on tarps while gallons of ice water were poured over their bodies. At least one prisoner died in CIA custody after being left shackled in frigid temperatures. No one was ever held to account for the American torture regime in Afghanistan. American drone strikes also started early in Afghanistan. The CIA killed Al Qaeda operative Mohammed Atef and others with a drone there in November 2001, just 2 months after 9/11. Afghanistan soon became the beta test site for high tech drone warfare, leading to countless civilian casualties and deep resentment among the Afghan people who felt helpless against the unseen threat circling overhead. America's early adoption of drone warfare in Afghanistan helped make a fortune for Neil Blue, the chair of General Atomics. The Southern California Energy and Defense Corporation manufactured the Predator, the first armed drone to fly over Afghanistan. General Atomics subsequently produced the Predator's follow on model, the Reaper. Blue and his brother Lyndon Blue, vice chair of General Atomics, maintained low public profiles throughout the war, but as owners of privately held General Atomics, they were among the first, but hardly the last, American contractors to enrich themselves as blood spilled in Afghanistan. That's usually what wars are fought for, and that's why we enter wars, even if it's not necessary for us to be a part of it, because it makes these people money, especially the military industrial complex, which is usually comprised of um, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and then apparently General Atomics, which I hadn't heard of. And it makes them a lot of money for sure. Before long, the CIA's drone campaign shifted from going after the few Al Qaeda operatives it could find in Afghanistan to targeting the Taliban, thus placing the drone campaign squarely in the midst of the Afghan domestic insurgency. The U.S. launched more than 13,000 drone strikes in Afghanistan between 2015 and 2020, killing up to 10,000 people, according to statistics kept by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. The CIA, relying on cell phone numbers to find, fix, and finish its alleged enemies, often launched its Hellfire missiles at the wrong targets or at targets standing amid groups of civilians. The practice devastated Afghan villages, yet the U.S. refused to keep track of civilian casualties from drone strikes. Instead, officials insisted that each strike had hit its intended target while ignoring the claims of villagers that the missiles had killed a tribal chief or decimated a meeting of village elders. Former Marine Infantry Officer Ian Cameron, who oversaw drone targeting in Afghanistan for 9 months in 2018 and 2019, wrote in the Washington Post of the, quote, sterility of this type of warfare, which allowed me to kill Taliban fighters in one moment and finish a half-eaten hamburger lunch the next, end quote. It seemed to him a Sisyphean exercise, since the Taliban never ran out of replacement fighters. And Sisyphean referring to a task that seems to never be able to get completed. Along with drone strikes came night raids in which U.S. and Afghan forces would burst into a home in the middle of the night and kill or capture those inside, breeding further resentment. The raids were so deeply unpopular that they sometimes led an entire village to switch its allegiance to the Taliban. What was worse, the U.S. military and the CIA failed for years to fully grasp the degree to which their airstrikes and night raids were being manipulated by Afghans who fed them false information to convince the Americans to launch raids against their local rivals or have those rivals carted off to Guantanamo. That's what I'm saying. When they were doing this, when they were taking these people to Guantanamo, they were being turned in by people because these people were trying to claim reward money that they were being offered. So it was very, very poorly done. After the initial invasion that ousted the Taliban, the U.S. shifted most of its military and intelligence resources from Afghanistan to Iraq in 2002 and 2003. The Bush administration believed that Iraq was a more important theater of war than Afghanistan and falsely thought that the war in Afghanistan was over. The shift of American resources by the Bush administration to Iraq was the greatest military miscalculation of the entire war in Afghanistan. While the U.S. was distracted by Iraq, the Taliban, which had been all but defeated and dispersed, recovered and regained strength. James Dobbins, a career diplomat who served as the Bush administration's special envoy to Afghanistan, said in an interview with the Special Inspector General that officials soon realized they had to decide which war would receive the most government resources and, quote, they chose Iraq. You had several years of calculated neglect in Afghanistan. It was intentional, end quote. Yet, even as the Bush administration drew down military in Afghanistan, it still insisted on creating a new pro Western government in Kabul and began a massive nation building project in the country. It did so without grasping the significance of several basic facts about the conditions it faced. Namely, that a civilization like Afghanistan, you cannot nation build it to be a republic like ours, a democratic republic, however you want to call it. uh, you can't build a nation like that in a place like Afghanistan in 20 years, 30, 40. It's going to take centuries, 2, 3, 4 centuries. It's nothing that we would ever see in our lifetime or our children's or our grandchildren's. It just wouldn't have happened. The first was that the Afghan militias with whom the United States had joined forces to overthrow the Taliban in 2001 were largely composed of and loyal to the country's minority ethnic groups, while the Taliban were Pashtun, by far the largest ethnic group in the country, representing more than 40% of the population. The Tajiks, who dominated the Northern Alliance, were America's most dependable allies throughout the war, but they accounted for only a little more than a quarter of Afghanistan's population. Even after the Taliban were ousted from power, they largely retained their support in rural southern Afghanistan, the country's Pashtun base. The U.S. and the government it installed in Kabul never figured out how to gain the loyalty of the rural Pashtun heartland. Yeah, good luck. The U.S. failed to fully understand how deeply those ethnic divides would undercut nation building in a country whose national identity had been weakened by decades of war. Even years after the U.S. backed government was installed, it was still easy in Kabul to identify which government ministers were Tajik. They were the ones whose offices were dominated by large portraits of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the so called Lion of the Panjshir, who led the Northern Alliance until he was assassinated by Al Qaeda 2 days before 9/11. Another fundamental miscalculation involved Pakistan. In the 1980s, the CIA had worked with Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, to support the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet forces occupying Afghanistan. But following the U.S. invasion in 2001, the Taliban leadership found sanctuary in Pakistan. The Taliban were able to reorganize and recruit new forces from among the more than 1 million mainly Pashtun Afghan refugees on Pakistan's side of the Durand Line, the boundary between Afghanistan and Pakistan established by the British at the end of the 19th century. Pakistan's intelligence and military services played a double game with the U.S. throughout the American war in Afghanistan. For years, Pakistan provided America with logistical support, allowing supplies for U.S. forces in landlocked Afghanistan to be transported through its territory. It also sometimes provided critical intelligence on Al Qaeda and terrorism suspects believed to be traversing the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Yet, many officers in Pakistan's inner services intelligence were Islamists who were sympathetic to the Pashtuns and the Taliban and had a long history of support for related Pashtun groups like the Haqqani Network, whose founder, Jalaluddin Haqqani, his Haqqani network, had been on the CIA payroll during the 1980s campaign against the Soviet occupation. What's more, Pakistani officials saw the war in Afghanistan through the lens of their ongoing Cold War with India. They were deeply suspicious of the ties between India and the Northern Alliance-based government installed by the U.S. in Kabul. The U.S. Pakistan alliance, built on lies, proved unsustainable. The Taliban survived the initial American onslaught in 2001, in large part because they had Pakistan's backing. A decade into the war, Pakistan began to tighten its grip on American supply routes. Relations worsened after protests erupted in Pakistan against U.S. drone strikes there, and they nearly broke down following the U.S. raid on Abbottabad in May 2011, in which American special forces killed Osama bin Laden. A subsequent NATO airstrike that hit two military facilities in Pakistan and killed 28 Pakistani troops in November 2011 further strained ties. The U.S. was eventually forced to rely on far more costly supply routes through Russia and Central Asia. Okay, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just kind of reading a few things. But it says here the Bush administration decided to stay in Afghanistan, but it no longer had any clear objectives. The original targets of the military mission, Osama bin Laden and the Al Qaeda leadership, had clearly escaped. So, what was America's new mission? Despite years of debate, the Bush White House couldn't decide. The Bush administration wanted to leave Afghanistan and focus on Iraq, yet it didn't want to leave the military field open on the Taliban. Bush didn't want to engage in nation building in Afghanistan, yet his government remained committed to creating a new Western style central government with modern roads, schools, hospitals, and a national army. The CIA even quietly did nation building of its own, creating the Afghan Intelligence Service, called the National Directorate of Security, and filling it with Tajiks on the CIA payroll. The result was that throughout his time in office, George W. Bush had one foot in and one foot out of Afghanistan. Stephen Hadley, Bush's national security advisor in his second term, weekly told the Special Inspector General that, quote, there was just no process to do post-war mission planning, end quote. So the U.S. installed Hamid Karzai, an ethnic Pashtun who had been living in exile in Pakistan and Afghanistan's first post-Taliban leader, and he went on to become Afghanistan's president. The Americans literally escorted Karzai into Afghanistan from Pakistan in 2001. When a U.S. aircraft accidentally bombed the group of special forces and CIA personnel bringing Karzai into the country, CIA officer Greg Vogel famously dove on top of Karzai, saving his life. Karzai had been chosen largely because he was pro-Western and because, in the view of the ethnic groups and warlords in Afghanistan at the time, he was the least offensive candidate. The fact that he was an ethnic Pashtun was thought to be an important olive branch to Pashtuns resentful of the U.S.-backed victory of the Tajiks and the Northern Alliance. But he was from a small Pashtun tribe based in the village of Kars outside Kandahar and was not considered a prominent leader among the major Pashtun tribes. It didn't take long for corruption to become rampant under Karzai. With the CIA's backing, the new president made his younger half-brother Ahmad Wali Karzai the de facto viceroy of Kandahar and southern Afghanistan and the boss of the massive Afghan heroin trade. Ahmed Wali Karzai's power over the heroin business meant that when tractor trailers loaded with drugs were stopped by local security forces, he could call their commanders to order the release of the trucks and their contents. Wonderful. The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration repeatedly uncovered evidence of Ahmad Wali Karzai's leading role in the Afghan drug trade. In one instance, American investigators discovered links between a truck found with 110 pounds of heroin and an intermediary for Ahmad Wali Karzai. The White House refused to allow the DEA to take any action against Ahmad Wali Karzai, who was secretly on the CIA's payroll. The willingness of the U.S. to turn a blind eye to Ahmed Karzai's role as a drug lord was just one symptom of a much larger problem. The U.S. had invaded a country whose most lucrative business, besides war, were opium production and heroin smuggling, and yet American officials could never figure out what to do about it. In the end, they did nothing. For 20 years, America essentially ran a narco state in Afghanistan. So each time American officials sought to make counter narcotics a priority, they ran into the reality that the drug lords of Afghanistan were also the warlords of Afghanistan who were on the CIA payroll and who the U.S. military relied upon to battle the Taliban. The U.S. spent nearly $9 billion on its token counter narcotics programs in Afghanistan, yet opium production and heroin smuggling in Afghanistan skyrocketed under the U.S. backed government. Afghanistan now produces more than 80% of the world's heroin supply. Afghanistan's opium production soared in 2002 and just kept growing. By 2020, 224,000 hectares, I don't know, of land were under opium poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, compared with 123,000 in 2010, according to the United Nations. What is this? Oh, I don't care. So a hectare or hectares, whatever, it's equal to 10,000. Um, what was it? 10,000 square meters. American aid and reconstruction money overwhelmed Afghanistan's economy. The U.S. provided $145 billion over 20 years to rebuild a country that had a gross domestic product of just $19 billion in 2019. As recently as 2018, nearly 80% of Afghan government spending came from Western donors. Much of the American money enriched U.S. contractors without ever entering the Afghan economy. Much of it also disappeared into secret bank accounts in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, held by Afghan government officials, warlords, and their families, a phenomenon described in a 2020 report by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as, quote, the cross-pollination of criminality between Afghanistan and Dubai, end quote. The frenetic example set by Kabul Bank provided the model for how the Afghan elite could efficiently and blatantly move American aid money out of Afghanistan and into their private offshore bank accounts. The bank, once the largest in Afghanistan, was founded by Shirkan Farnood, a money exchange dealer with operations in Kabul and Dubai, who had fled Russia under suspicion that he was a money launderer. After he obtained the bank charter from the Karzai government, he used Kabul Bank to embezzle money from Afghan depositors to pay for his personal investments in Dubai real estate. Farnood also took out $100 million in loans from Kabul Bank to buy Pamir Airways, which flew commercial routes from Kabul to Dubai. So, meanwhile, petty corruption, bribes to local officials to obtain any service or job, was endemic, stoking more resentment against the government among average Afghans. The UN found that by 2012, Afghans were paying $3.9 billion in bribes per year. Half of all Afghans paid a bribe for a public service. As the U.S. backed government continued, petty bribery and corruption got worse, not better. Militias were using their position and closeness with the government and U.S. military to control roads, secure lucrative contracts, establish themselves as regional powers, and sometimes serve both sides, cooperating with both international and Taliban forces to maximize profits, concluded a 2018 report from the Institute of World Politics. So perhaps the most cynical decision in the war in Afghanistan was taken by Obama in 2009. During the 2008 presidential campaign, Obama sought to distinguish himself from his main political rivals with his emphatic denunciations of the war in Iraq. Fearful of being attacked from the right for being too dovish, Obama balanced his attack on the Iraq war by claiming that he would do no more than the Bush administration had done to win the good war in Afghanistan. In 2009, Obama announced that he was escalating U.S. troop levels in Afghanistan. His ill-considered Afghan surge. The surge came with no real long-term strategy, and it is hard not to see Obama's decision as little more than a political calculation to live up to his earlier campaign promise, which had only been made to insulate him from attacks on the position on Iraq. As American troops flowed steadily into Afghanistan in 2009 and 2010, combat operations were focused on the south, notably Helmand Province, a stronghold of both the Taliban and opium production. U.S. troop levels peaked at about 100,000 during the surge, the highest levels of the entire war in Afghanistan. But the surge quickly descended into an inconclusive war of attrition. U.S. casualties reached their highest levels of the war during the surge, with fatalities rising to 496 in 2010. Obama drew down U.S. forces to around 8,400 by the time he left office. Donald Trump came into presidency in 2017, having campaigned on a vow to end America's forever wars. He was determined to withdraw all troops from Afghanistan, but he was easily distracted by cronies eager to make money. Eric Prince, the infamous founder of Blackwater, nearly convinced Trump to let him take over the entire combat mission in Afghanistan by using paid mercenaries instead of U.S. troops. Instead, Trump got so sidetracked that he let the Pentagon talk him into increasing troop levels to about 14,000 in 2017. Trump finally got his way in February 2020 when the U.S. and the Taliban signed an agreement setting the conditions for a complete withdrawal of U.S. troops from Afghanistan by May 1, 2021. After the 2020 presidential election, Acting Defense Secretary Chris Miller announced that U.S. troop levels had been reduced to 2,500. Joe Biden came into office this year, making the case that after 20 years, the war in Afghanistan had to end. Getting out of Afghanistan was perhaps the only issue on which he publicly agreed with Donald Trump. On April 14th, he announced that all U.S. troops would be withdrawn by September 11th, 2021, the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Trump promptly criticized Biden for failing to meet the May 1st deadline he had negotiated with the Taliban, saying that, quote, "We can and should get out earlier, and getting out of Afghanistan is a wonderful and positive thing to do. I plan to withdraw on May 1st, and we should keep as close to that schedule as possible," end quote. The Taliban also issued a statement in April criticizing Biden for failing to meet the agreed upon deadline. They warned ominously that the delay opens the way for the Taliban to take every necessary countermeasure. The meaning and consequences of that Taliban statement in April are now playing out at Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul. The U.S. certainly did some good in Afghanistan. Its nation building created a new educated urban middle class, and the U.S. backed government offered unprecedented rights to women. By 2018, life expectancy had increased by 9 years, literacy rates rose, and child mortality fell. But the Special Inspector General's final report, which documents those gains, concluded that they were not commensurate with the U.S. investment. A former Pentagon official told the Special Inspector General that when you look at how much we spent and what we got for it, it's mind boggling. In an interview with the Special Inspector General Douglas Lute, who coordinated strategy for Afghanistan at the National Security Council from 2007 to 2013, gave a brief and devastating critique of the American enterprise in Afghanistan. Quote, "We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. We didn't know what we were doing." End quote. Also, not only were we lied to about what was going on in Afghanistan, but there are a lot of crimes, I would say war crimes, that we committed while we were there. Now, I don't like to have to run down troops or our leadership. I wish I could uphold and honor and praise all of them, but you can't all the time. This is from socialistworker.co.uk. And this includes some of the accounts of how soldiers, after entering a village, quote, would take the men and boys to these guest houses and interrogate them, meaning tie them up and torture them, end quote. When the soldiers left the village, the men and boys could be found dead, shot in the head, sometimes blindfolded and throats slit. These are corroborated accounts. One account describes allegations that two 14-year-old boys suspected of being Taliban sympathizers had their throats slit. The bodies were bagged and thrown into a nearby river. It's a rare glimpse of the truth of what the West wars actually mean, and we shouldn't allow the focus on Australia to let Britain's occupying forces off the hook. While Australia has been forced to shine a spotlight on its atrocities, Britain has done its best to keep its own under wraps. So this is mostly talking about Australia and Britain, but we're part of the West too. We were also there. So it's really sad. It says here U.S. lawyer Tina Foster, who argued several cases on behalf of Bagram detainees, says that Bagram was worse than Guantanamo and has always been a torture chamber. One former British Special Forces officer said that hundreds of individuals have been detained by British forces in Afghanistan and Iraq. They were routinely handed over to U.S. forces in the knowledge that they would be tortured. The fact that such places existed shows the hypocrisy of those who claim the war was started on humanitarian grounds. They draw up laws to supposedly ban such atrocities and make their wars seem legitimate, just, and civilized. That's true. So they grab on your heartstrings because they say it's a humanitarian cause. They tell you about the women and children, and you want to help them. But that's just the cover up of why we're there. It's not really why we're there. Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. Junior soldiers were also required by superiors to murder prisoners as their first kill, known as blooding, and photographers of a senior special forces soldier drinking alcohol out of the prosthetic leg of a dead Taliban fighter circulated a week after the report was released. Officers higher up in the rankings knew what was going on. Such cases are not one-offs in an otherwise justifiable war, and that's precisely why Britain wants to cover up its own crimes. After the Brereton report was released, the British Ministry of Defence said, quote, "Our armed forces are held to the highest standards, and the service police have carried out extensive and independent investigations into alleged misconduct of UK forces in Afghanistan," end quote. There's plenty of evidence that shows, it says, two senior officers, okay. Says here that there's plenty of evidence that shows this isn't true, but measures are put in place from the top to cover them up, so they're not doing independent investigations. The Overseas Operations Bill was introduced to Parliament in March 2020. It provides legal protections to armed forces personnel and veterans serving in military operations overseas. These troops cannot be prosecuted due to alleged offenses committed on overseas military operations more than 5 years ago. Soldiers would be extremely unlikely to face court action relating to war in Afghanistan. The government also closed Operation Northmoor in 2017. This was the official investigation of British Special Forces in Afghanistan, set up in 2014 to examine criminal allegations. At its peak, it investigated 675 criminal allegations from 159 complaints, including 52 accusations of wrongful deaths. It was supposed to run until 2021, but the MOD pushed for this early closure, as well as the investigation into crimes committed in Iraq. This meant accusations being investigated were abandoned and key Afghan witnesses were not interviewed. Any charges made had to be dropped, and no case investigated led to a prosecution. So I'm not going to read this whole thing. This is just a little bit of kind of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes in the wars. And then soldiers also tell the real war story in Afghanistan. This is from channel4.com, written by Nick Patton Walsh. And this was back in 2010. So they were even talking about it then. Says, "We all heard the boom, but didn't know what it had done. An hour later, it was clear from the sullen faces in the base headquarters it had meant the worst. The skyline around the 82nd Airborne Base, COP Winkleman, is a regular cacophony of dull thuds, echoing bangs, and loud pops. It's IED country, the improvised explosive devices that kill so many here." But that morning, the normal backdrop brought with it the worst news that this unit had had in 9 months, and it came in the closing 4 weeks of their deployment. The boom was caused by the IED that killed Sergeant Brian Piercy outright, the 1,111th casualty of America's war here. He had been leading his men on a patrol and came to a corner of the road where a large homemade device had been laid. The device itself was detonated by what they call a command wire. This means the insurgent lies in wait and triggers the device when they choose. When the unit got there to support the platoon under fire, they followed the command wire. It went on to the point they could no longer follow it. These things are often booby traps themselves. The atmosphere in the unit obviously changed massively. There is exhaustion in everyone's face, a lot of anger, a need for some privacy, and the thought that you heard repeatedly. And this is a picture of Sergeant Brian Piercy. He's from Clovis, California. He was 27. He died on July 19 in Ar- uh, Arghandab River Valley in Afghanistan. He sustained injuries from the IED. He was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 4th Brigade Combat Team, 82nd Airborne Division. All right. That it happens all the time, but this was different. Sergeant Piercy was a friend. One of the basic flaws of the embed system is that at times like this, the openness you often see from the U.S. Army about their procedures evaporates. They're on the defensive, and you have to carefully navigate their sensitivity at that time. After all, these men would in the coming weeks be the guns we relied on to keep us safe as we went on patrol. The week we then spent with Sergeant Piercy's friends was one lived in the shadow of his loss. They took us to Kuhak Schoolhouse, a remarkable building replete with Oxfam classroom benches that the U.S. Army had to remove 22 separate IEDs from when they first got there. The fields around the base are still heavily mined from this conflict and the last, that they're off limits. The men insisted that revenge never dictated their operations, but you could smell the anger that drove their daily routine. But this was underlaid with the restraint born of the knowledge they knew they would probably never catch the men who laid the IED, that they could kill all the wrong people if they got out of control, that the insurgents they face in ambushes and firefights are rarely the bomb makers, that a bomb maker is most likely to be killed by his own devices if he proves to be not a very good maker of bombs. Every day we would patrol, and every day they would hope to ambush someone, but it was not the search of violence that proved the most unnerving. It was, in the light of a death so recent and raw from an IED, the omnipresent threat of a bomb everywhere you tread. Inside the orchards, the dense and shaded groves where so many patrols took place, we saw how impossible that threat is to navigate. Look under your feet, look to the walls to either side. They could all contain bombs, but don't forget to look upwards. The latest place for bombs is in the trees. There is genuinely no escape. The men led by Sergeant Aaron Best, a square-jawed man of 27 months hard fighting in Afghanistan, together with two other sergeants, Adam Morris and Mike Herman, shared their neurosis, their confusion, their disenchantment. Sergeant Morris's inability to get the image of his friend died out of his mind. Quote, "A body's not supposed to be broken apart that way." End quote. Sergeant Herman's admission, "You can't ever tell where the next bomb could come from." Quote, "You literally are the most paranoid person in the world while you're out there. You don't know where it's going to come from. Pre-deployment training, they tell you, look for upturned dirt. There's upturned dirt everywhere. Look for markers in the trees. There are markers in the trees everywhere." And Sergeant Best's disenchantment after 4 years, quote, "I've been here every year since 2007. I came here in 2007. I was getting shot up, blown up, losing friends, and I come back here on 2010. I'm getting shot at, blown up, losing friends. I've been here 4 years, and nothing has changed." At the close of their tour, the abiding feeling was one of the insurmountable challenges that they had faced, sullied, perhaps, with the knowledge that once they got home, they wouldn't have to go over it all again and again in the privacy of their lives to come. So this is what they were dealing with over there. There's a lot more. I will link all of these in the description box, and I will link some of the articles about the torture at Guantanamo Bay in the description box. So I hope that you'll take a look at those. Um, Please join me. My Facebook is Lauren Collins. I just got to say something. You can email me, gotta say something 21 at gmail.com. My subreddit is r/just gotta say something. Instagram, gotta say something 21. I also have my link tree in the description box. That'll take you to all of my social media links if you would like to do that. And don't forget, you can buy a t-shirt and to sign the petition to protect women in prisons. I would appreciate it. If you're on audio only, please go find my podcast on Pandora, Spotify, Google, Apple, Anchor, wherever you like. Subscribe to the show. Give me a review. I would appreciate it. And also, if you're on YouTube, don't forget to like this video, share this video, leave me a comment. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Also, the best thing you can do for me is just subscribe to my channel. It would mean so, so much to me. And I hope that you have a good rest of your day. God bless.